She grew up watching him fight from her living room. Now people are comparing her to him. Her response tells you everything about who she really is. In the next few minutes, I'm breaking down exactly what Eala said when asked about being compared to Manny Pacquiao, why that comparison carries so much weight in the Philippines specifically, and what her response reveals about how she's handling this entire moment in her career. But there's one specific line from her answer that I think says more about her character than almost anything else she's said publicly this year. I'll get to that. Let's start with the context, because this comparison didn't come out of nowhere. Manny Pacquiao recently posted on social media congratulating Eala for bringing honor and victory to the Philippines. He said Filipinos everywhere are cheering for her and proud of what she's accomplished. For anyone unfamiliar with what Pacquiao actually represents in Filipino culture, that kind of public endorsement is an enormous deal. This isn't just a retired athlete offering a polite congratulations. This is arguably the most beloved sports figure in the entire history of the Philippines, publicly aligning himself with a rising tennis star and effectively passing a torch of national pride. So naturally, at her pre-tournament press conference ahead of the Cincinnati Open, reporters asked Eala directly about being compared to Pacquiao, and her response is worth breaking down in detail because it reveals a level of self-awareness and humility that's genuinely rare in a 21-year-old suddenly experiencing this level of attention. She started by acknowledging just how surreal the entire comparison feels to her personally. She said she grew up watching Pacquiao's fights back home, and that it never crossed her mind that she'd one day be mentioned in the same breath as him. Think about that for a second. This is someone who was a genuine fan, sitting at home, watching those fights unfold on television like millions of other Filipinos. Now she's being publicly praised by that same figure, and she's clearly still processing what that actually means. She went on to explain exactly why Pacquiao matters so much to Filipino identity. She said, quote, Pacquiao is such a sporting legend for us Filipinos, and he's done a lot for us athletes. Then she added something I think is genuinely insightful. She described the specific feeling he gave to Filipinos, saying it was great to have someone to rally around, that whenever he had fights, everyone was excited, and it created a chance for people to come together. That's a really thoughtful way to describe what Pacquiao represents beyond just his boxing accomplishments. He became a unifying figure, someone whose fights genuinely brought an entire country together around a shared source of pride, regardless of background or circumstance. Eala clearly understands that dynamic intimately because she experienced it herself as a fan before ever becoming a professional athlete. Wait, because here's the part of her response that I think reveals the most about her character, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Despite being flattered by the comparison, Eala made a clear point of drawing a distinction between her own journey and Pacquiao's. She said, quote, they are two very different journeys, so I don't think one takes away from the other. I think I'm still very, very far from the levels of Pacquiao, but I think they both have their own beautiful set of characteristics. That's an incredibly mature response for someone at this stage of her career, especially while receiving this level of public praise. It would have been easy and honestly understandable for a 21-year-old to simply accept the comparison at face value and lean into the flattery. Instead, Eala immediately reframed the conversation, acknowledging real respect for what Pacquiao accomplished, while being genuinely honest that she doesn't view herself as being anywhere near that same level yet. Here's what I actually think about this response. There's a specific kind of confidence that comes from being able to accept praise without letting it distort your own self-assessment. Eala isn't rejecting the comparison outright, and she's clearly moved by what it represents. But she's also not getting carried away by it, or pretending her current body of work matches the legacy of someone widely considered the greatest Filipino athlete in modern history. That kind of grounded perspective, especially in the middle of an incredible run of results, tells you a lot about how she's likely to handle even bigger moments of attention as her career continues to grow. Let's talk about why this comparison matters so much in the first place, because it's genuinely significant within the context of Filipino sports culture specifically. Pacquiao's impact goes far beyond his list of world titles and boxing records. He became a symbol of what's possible for an entire nation, proof that a Filipino athlete could reach the very top of a global sport and be respected everywhere in the world. For decades, he was essentially the singular figure Filipinos point to when discussing sporting greatness on the international stage. Eala reaching a level where she's even being mentioned in that same conversation, regardless of how she personally frames the comparison, tells you something important about the moment she's currently living through in her career. She's become the first Filipina ranked in the WTA Tour's top 20. She's already won her first career title this year in Washington. She's reached a career high seeding at a WTA 1000 event heading into Cincinnati. Individually, each of those accomplishments is significant. Collectively, they're starting to create exactly the kind of national rallying point that Pacquiao provided for so many years. I think that's actually the real story hiding underneath this press conference exchange. It's not really about whether Eala's tennis achievements technically measure up to Pacquiao's boxing legacy, a comparison she herself has already dismissed as unfair to make directly. It's about the fact that tennis, a sport that's historically had a much smaller footprint in Filipino sports culture compared to boxing, is now producing a figure capable of generating that same kind of national excitement and unity. Here's what I actually think this means going forward. Whether or not Eala ever reaches the same historical stature as Pacquiao within Filipino sports, and that's a genuinely difficult bar to clear given everything he accomplished over his career. The comparison itself signals something meaningful about how far her profile has already grown. People don't casually compare rising athletes to national icons unless something real is happening. The fact that this comparison is even being made, and that Pacquiao himself chose to publicly endorse it, tells you Eala's impact on Filipino sports culture is already being taken seriously at the highest level. Let's also acknowledge the timing of all this, because it's happening during an incredibly demanding stretch of her season. This press conference took place ahead of her opening match at the Cincinnati Open, where she's set to compete against Elena Gabriela Rus on Saturday, August 15th. That means she's fielding these kinds of deeply personal, culturally significant questions while simultaneously preparing for one of the most important tournaments remaining before the US Open. Handling that balance, staying grounded and thoughtful in interviews while also competing at an elite level physically, is its own kind of skill that doesn't always get the credit it deserves. I think what stands out most from this entire exchange is how naturally Eala navigated a genuinely complicated question. Comparisons to legendary figures can be uncomfortable to address publicly, especially when the gap in accomplishment is still significant. She could have deflected the question entirely or leaned too heavily into false modesty. Instead, she gave an answer that was honest, respectful, and genuinely thoughtful about what both journeys actually represent, without diminishing either one in the process. Tennis IQ will be following Eala's tournament run in Cincinnati closely, starting with her opening match against Ruse this Saturday. Given everything happening around her right now, both on the court and in terms of her growing cultural significance back home, this is shaping up to be one of the more fascinating storylines in tennis heading into the final stretch before the US Open. If you want that coverage the moment her match begins, make sure you're subscribed. Here's my question for you. Do you think Eala's impact on Filipino sports culture eventually reaches the same level Pacquiao achieved? Or is that simply too high a bar for any athlete to realistically match? Drop your honest take in the comments, because I want to hear what this community genuinely believes.